You are listening to the SDSU podcast presented by the East Village Times with your hosts Andre Hagberdian and Paul Garrison. Welcome, listeners, back to another episode of the SDSU podcast. I'm your host, as always, Andre Hagberdian. We'll be joined shortly by my co-host, Paul Garrison. Today, we had a chance to catch up with Sean Dillon, who is the newest director of player personnel at San Diego State. That role is responsible for heading the recruiting department and overseeing the recruiting coordinators that are on staff. As you'll hear from Sean, he goes way back with Coach Sean Lewis. Although they are good friends and have stayed in touch, Sean Dillon has had a very good and successful career as a director of player personnel at UCF when they were an undefeated team fighting for a national championship in their eyes, and Nebraska following Scott Cross to Nebraska and leading some top recruiting classes under Scott Cross. So it was a good chance to catch up and get to know Sean Dillon, see what kind of recruiting has been put into place under the new staff and how it may differ from what's happening at other staffs around the country. After that, Paul and I will give you our takeaways from the interview, and then we'll finish up the episode by talking a little basketball and San Diego State's loss to UConn in the Sweet 16, how we think that season went in terms of it being a success, how the team could look next year with so many departures from the starting lineup. So let's get to the interview with Sean Dillon. We want to welcome Sean Dillon, Director of Player Personnel for San Diego State, to the podcast. How's it going, Coach?
Doing great. How are you guys doing?
Very well, thank you.
So this is your first year at San Diego State. Why did you want to work under Sean Lewis and the San Diego State staff here?
Yeah, you know what? I've been around, and I actually grew up in the same town as Coach Lewis. And 8th grade, I was the fullback, and he was the quarterback on the middle school team. And then we won a championship. Obviously, we always stayed in touch throughout high school to college years, and even when we started working in this profession of college football, and we always stayed in touch, and we'd throw ideas off each other in terms of recruiting and everything like that. So obviously his vision for how he wants to run a football program and how he wants to run the talent acquisition piece of it fits exactly what I want to do as well. So and plus San Diego.
Can't beat that.
You get to work where everyone wants a vacation at. So I just thought the pieces were together in terms of location, staff, Coach Lewis's vision was too good of an opportunity to pass up.
Yesterday,
when Coach Lewis says so he'll say, hey, when you're recruiting a quarterback, do you remember what I look like in the 8th grade? Get that. That's pretty much how it works.
Yeah, exactly.
Paul had a chance to catch up with Coach Lewis after practice yesterday, and he mentioned about your organizational skills as a big reason he hired you. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so I've been in, I think this is my 14th year in college football and recruiting, and everything's a little bit different. It depends, but when I got hired, we had a whole new staff. So the biggest thing is kind of putting your process together where you're not just basically throwing it all at the coaches. It has to go piece by piece so it makes sense, okay? So basically one of the first things, obviously, when we got here, we were still trying to finish up the 24 class, all right, in January. So we had, I think that first weekend, we had a bunch of transfer portal guys in here, and we're still trying to finish out that transfer portal class, and the 24 class But at the same time, you got to kind of get going on the 25 guys. So, like, you had to have a process in place of how you want to put it together so the coaches kind of, you give coaches direction on what to do, because we never want to stop recruiting and you never want to slow down the process either. So what we kind of did was, the first piece of the puzzle was obviously our coaches were on the road recruiting, so I had to set up all their week visits in the month of January. We had to finish that out, but in between that, the first thing I did was I needed to give the coaches their areas. That will help them with the 25 class and the 26 class. So the first thing that we did as a staff, as a recruiting talent acquisition staff, was piece together their recruiting areas so they could start building relationships with the high school coaches. They could start gathering lists of their prospects in their area. So that was kind of the first major thing that we did together as a staff, is areas. The second main thing we did together was basically we all got together as a staff, and I call them critical factors. And each coach kind of had to go around the room and kind of give us the 3 to 4 top critical factors at their position of what they look for on film, but also in person. Mm-hmm. So when other coaches are evaluating film in their area of other positions, they know exactly what the position coach wants as a linebacker. So Coach Schmidt wants as a linebacker. So that kind of helped tie together our grading scale as well. So once we got those critical factors, we came together as a staff and we built our grading scale with those critical factors. The next thing is we started watching a bunch of 2025 film as an area coach first. So we want to build our pipeline, and how we do it is we go area coach, and then we go to position coach, and then I have the offensive defensive staff watch all those guys that are potential offer guys. And then it comes to me, and then we go to Coach Lewis. Okay, so that's how we build our pipeline of how it flows, the process of our film evaluation. So we're getting multiple looks from different coaches. So we have a lot of eyes on them, okay, when we're watching the film. So once we did our area coaching areas as a coaching staff, and once we kind of built our grading scale, now it was just trying to get as much film evaluations as possible for the 2025 class. So I was able to give them a huge list each week, and Coach Lewis was awesome with scheduling each day a talent acquisition meaning where they have time throughout the day to solely watch film as an area coach, as a position coach, as a staff. So we've probably watched over the 2025 class, I'm guessing 600 guys, 700 guys in a 2-month period. So that was impressive. And this is the first time I kind of done it this way. And I always started my previous stops. I always started with the recruiting staff as the number one first in line for evaluations, and then we pass them along. But this way, when I talked to Coach Lewis about it this way, and he explained is we have 10 full-time coaches, if that's correct. Yep, 10 full-time coaches. So we have 10 extra evaluators instead of a recruiting staff of maybe 3. So we're able to double, triple the evaluations on film by just using the area coaches first to knock out the list. So which is awesome. I love how we're doing the process of our pipeline. And the great thing about it too is we're able to get to our list a lot quicker. And we basically we do a lot. We start off with highlight films, but we also, if there's guys that we want to move on to the next level, we make point of attack films. So when we do decide if he's an offer guy, we have to make sure that the point of attack film checks out with the highlight film. So we're always going to watch that game film before we make that offer. So lots of checks and balances in terms of how we run things, but so far so smooth. And then on top of that, in January we had 2 junior days back to back as well, trying to get the top 25 guys here, and then so it's been busy, but I think we have the process in place where our coaching staff knows exactly what to do each day for talent acquisition. So as long as you guide them and give them what they need to do, they do an excellent job, elite job of doing what they need to do. And that was the biggest thing when I talked to Coach Lewis about like each day for talent acquisition. If you don't give your staff what they need to do, they don't know what to do with that time. But if you give them a list of guys to always eval, or if you tell them, hey, defensive staff, offensive staff, you guys got to get together, you got to watch 10 guys who are potential offer guys. So we use that time wisely as a talent acquisition recruiting process for each day.
Great. Would you be willing to go over the 10 assistants and where their areas are?
Yeah, so we'll start with quarterbacks. Matty Johnson. He is basically Orange County is his area, all right, and then he will dip into Vegas or Nevada as well. Hagen is Los Angeles County. Lenny Sumler is basically Lenny Sampson. I'm sorry, Coach Sampson is basically he is like San Fernando Valley. Tight ends is Zach Barn. Zach Barn is going to be San Francisco down to San Jose. O-line, Coach Schmidt, Mike Schmidt is San Diego. D-line, Coach Lose is Simi Valley, so Oaks Christian, that area. Edges Rob, Coach Ulrich is basically the Bay Area, from Concord all the way down to Oakland. Eric Schmidt, linebacker DC, he is Sacramento down to Modesto, and then he's going to do part of Phoenix, Arizona. Sumler is part San Diego as well with Coach O-Line Smith, and then he's going to work his way up to the Inland Empire. CJ McGorsk is Fresno. He's going to do the desert Fresno up until basically Bakersfield. And then Zach Barn, I forgot to mention, Zach Barn is part of Phoenix as well. And then we kind of split up Dallas, Texas with Coach Sampson and Coach McGorsk as well. Our goal was to make sure that obviously we take care of California first. We want to recruit the state. I don't feel like we need to go far to get a recruiting class. So we wanted to make sure every coach had a recruiting area in California. We wanted to make sure that San Diego was the most important location. That's why we split up San Diego with Coach Schmidt and Coach Sumler. Phoenix was great because it's 4 hours away drive. So we wanted 2 coaches there as well. And then like the Bay Area has been awesome for us. I think we've had 10, 20, 25 offered kids come visit us in the last 2 weeks from the Bay Area already. So we're trying to hit up as much as possible in California as a state. And then Phoenix, we'll dip into Phoenix, we'll dip into Nevada, we'll dip into Washington, Oregon. Yeah. With how we run it with our GAs. But we want to make sure that we took care of California first, especially San Diego.
That makes a lot of sense, especially with the Northern California people. They're always jealous of SoCal. It's just how it is. But Coach Lewis, he appears to be a pretty good recruiter, man. Are there limitations to what a head coach can do in this process? And like on the recruiting trail, what's Coach Lewis's approach? Is he the closer? Does he get like a couple of guys that he focuses on? I mean, how does that work with how his recruiting, I guess, role is played with the Aztecs?
Yeah, obviously so in the contact period, which is basically right after the season when it opens back up, I think it was December 4th this past year. I forgot what date it exactly was. It was right after the conference championship games. The head coach and all of our coaches can go out on the road recruiting in December, January, up until signing day. Until that in the spring, Coach Lewis isn't able to go out on the road because it's a evaluation period. So Coach Lewis is kind of stuck in the office when the rest of the coaches are out in the evaluation period in the spring. But the great thing about like Coach Lewis is how involved he is with not only visits but phone calls, all that type of stuff. We we basically do a power hour every Wednesday, and basically what it is all of our coaches have a list of guys that I gave them to get on the phone. The recruits call the coaches, and basically we just kind of pass along the phone, and then Coach Lewis is always on the phone with them as well. So Coach Lewis wants to incorporate himself as much as possible. We recruit as a staff here, which I love. It's not just the position coach recruiting their position. We have the area coach. We have multiple coaches recruiting everyone, and we also have Coach Lewis recruiting as much as possible too.
Last question for you before we let you go. The recruiting has definitely changed in the last few years, obviously with the transfer portal and the windows that they have. How would you say you prioritize your time between high school recruits and transfer portal recruits?
Well, high school, you're always recruiting. You're always watching film. You never have too much of a board, like too big of a board. So high school kids are always recruiting, and you're always trying to get them here for a visit. You're always evaluating film. Transfer portal kind of splits it up because right now it's not open. But once it opens up, we got how we do it here and how we're gonna run it here is we're gonna have basically a couple guys in charge of just transfer portal recruiting, and then we'll still continue our process of the high school film evaluation as well. So it doesn't really change much. We just add more film evaluations on top of what we're already doing.
Got it.
So yeah.
Awesome. Well, definitely appreciate you taking the time. I know it's a busy time for everybody. Would love to get some insight from you on the recruiting process, and hope to chat with you again sometime.
Of course. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.
Well, we had a chance to catch up with Sean Dillon, the newest director of player personnel. Unfortunately, that position's been kind of a revolving door at San Diego State, even under Brady Hoke. I remember when Craig Smith left after Matt Rosano had left the industry.
Right.
I asked Brady Hoke why he's had trouble keeping someone in that role, and he flat out said, "We don't pay them enough. We need to pay them more." It's a public university. They obviously have salary limits and budgets and things like that. And I don't know if that's any different under Sean Lewis, but bringing in someone that he played in middle school together, that he has a similar vision with and a history with, I think he's looking for it to become a good long-term solution here. What did you think about our conversation with Sean?
Well, I mean, I enjoyed it. I think that, obviously we've been doing a lot of these, and, they'll be coming out, as we go through the off season here. But I think of all of them, this was the one that I kind of wish we could do twice. I mean, don't get me wrong.
Longer than 15 minutes.
Yeah, I feel like I could talk to all these guys for, an hour plus each of them and have tons of stuff. I mean, so many things that we crossed off our list to try to go with, but this one, even in like a departure from what we did with the other coaches, where we didn't really get to see like what makes him tick. We didn't really get to even see his philosophy, what he's looking for in recruits, what more detailed stuff that he does. because, obviously the time constraints and we wanted to be able to get to what we got to. So I thought he gave a terrific overview of, what happens at San Diego State. Obviously wrote an article about it. I do believe that they did increase the salary for this position compared to what it was previous. And, it's interesting because I think we all have people that we've known for a long period of time. And, over some beers or something like that, you talk about all sorts of weird theoretical situations. And now these guys get to actually like bring this about and be able to see if there is something special to what they were talking about. I think what stood out to me the most is, it's different than what the previous staff did. It's different than what Sean Dillon has done in any of his other stops. And, it's interesting only because there's going to be proof whether or not they did a good job or not. I mean, San Diego State, for whatever you want to say, there's positions that it absolutely recruited well, sent guys to the NFL, have had a lot of talent in the way that they were recruiting previously. And it'll be interesting to see as they leave that, will they be successful? But what's that for you?
Yeah, we didn't, as you said, with our limited time, we didn't really get into his backstory. This isn't a case of Sean Lewis hiring his middle school friend, to give him a job.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Sean Dillon was director of player personnel for Scott Frost, both for 2 years at UCF and then 5 years at Nebraska. 3 of those years at Nebraska, they had a top 20 recruiting class in the country. So Sean brings a lot of experience and success in that role at multiple stops. Before UCF, he was at Oregon on the same as like different roles. He was like a director of high school. Oregon's a big program, so they've got and things like that. So he's had 14 years in college football recruiting. That's a lot of experience, a lot of background, a lot of success. And I think that's key. He talked about kind of doing things a little bit differently that he's used to. And he went through some of that in terms of like how they use the position coaches, how they use the recruiting coordinators, how they schedule time every day for each position coach to watch film. We don't, I don't know if they did that as much here under the prior staff, but maybe they do it other places. Maybe they don't do it other places. I don't know too much about that, but it sounded a little bit different than how things have been done here. And, ultimately it's California first, Southern California first, and then branch out to the Arizonas and the Texases and the Pacific Northwest and things like that. But, they've got a plan. And in the fact that they executed it pretty well with such a short period of time in December for the early signing period, shows that they've had some success and they hope to have some more.
Well, I mean, so I don't think that the initial recruiting class was under Sean Dillon. I think they still had the group in place before, which made complete sense considering he just got involved in at the very, very end of November, beginning of December. And it's only a couple weeks before that. So I think like what this looks like moving forward is just interesting, because I think if you were to try to break down and understand like kind of like what Brady Hoke tried to do and what they did under that staff, I think, you had the same breakup of California for sure. And, obviously different coaches in different places and things of that nature, but they still, everybody had a geographic region in California. But then the other thing that was also added to that is it seemed like wherever those guys, the staff, the coaches, like their hometowns were, they also were recruiting those areas as well. So like obviously Jeff Horton's the most famous for what he did in Dallas, but they started getting into Utah because some of their coaches were from there. Savai Eselu in Hawaii, he did that because that's where he's from. And so I think that you don't really see that element with this staff, where at least with what he's saying. And I don't know if that's because these guys are from so far away in the Midwest that it just doesn't make sense for them to do that. If because they are all young coaches, like they came over and they're making the move to San Diego, So those places are not necessarily home anymore. But I do think that it's a little bit of a departure, and I think one of the interesting parts to me is, I don't think it's normal that they schedule time every day to recruit. And it's not that they weren't doing something or that they didn't have a recruiting element, but the amount of time and, was going to say, Sean Dillon talked about Sean Lewis being really great in this regard. Well, you're only really great in that regard if you stand out, and so I wonder two things. I mean, I wonder, one, can you really be great at both? As they are trying to put in their identity on the field, you only have so much bandwidth as a human being, and so I think that's really interesting. And then the other part is, they're working all kinds of crazy hours, and what will staff retention look like? If this is not the way things are done at other places, will some of these guys go and say, hey, I could have greater work-life balance over here because I don't have to have this extra element always in part of my job. And so I think that's another really interesting component to this. Will they always kind of have like those younger coaches and things of that nature who maybe can put in a few more hours because they have less family obligations, or how all that stuff works out? But I think that's a really other like big element. If they are actually doing something new, and it's new enough that Sean Dillon, who's an expert in the area, called it something he's never seen before. It's just interesting, like how much they can keep going to that same well and being able to get the same results.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at from a recruiting perspective, I think we could comfortably say that the prior staff did a good job recruiting high school players. They weren't getting 4 or 5-star guys, but they were getting very high 3-star guys who were playing, guys who ended up transferring and going to Power 5 schools because they were good players. I think where a lot of fans might have had angst was their transfer portal and the lack of offensive and defensive linemen, especially last year, where it looked like, okay, they're only going out and getting JUCO guys on the lines. Why is that? They're not doing a good job. And we wondered where NIL played a factor in that. Well, we're seeing with the new staff, maybe it's unfair because they just got here.
Yeah.
But like, they brought in FCS guys. They brought in JUCO guys. They didn't bring in any Power 5 guys on the offensive or defensive lines. And so that's a real problem for San Diego State, regardless of whoever the coach is. And, you can look at basketball and the NIL and the lack of bringing in a center to replace Nathan Mensah. Well, the offensive and defensive line, as Coach Lewis has said, come at a premium. And that premium tends to be NIL. And so far, they're still going to the JUCO ranks, just like the previous staff was, and the FCS ranks. And we'll see if they can develop them better, right? You got a different coaching staff, a different offensive line and defensive line coach. Maybe they can develop those guys to be starters right away, where they're, struggled with last year or 2 years ago. But it's interesting to look at a different recruiting staff, different coaching staff, and see what impact that has immediately.
No, I agree. And I would say how I would view that is I definitely would absolutely give it an asterisk and say these guys just started.
Yeah.
And their ability to kind of hold together and add some more to that class, I thought was actually pretty impressive. I don't feel like there's been this huge drop off in terms of like high school recruiting. I don't, as exciting as Sean Lewis is, and I've been watching Colorado, I've been watching Kent State, I've been watching Baylor's offense to try to understand it and try to do this job as good as I can. It's exciting, and I think it's exciting for players, it's exciting for fans, but I don't know that it's exciting enough to be able to reverse the trends that are in college football. To your point about the basketball team,
They were in the national title game. And, you know, they had the opportunity to come play next to Jaden Ledee, to have a veteran team around them. And I mean, they got to Sweet 16. You know what I mean? Like you get one of those centers that they were, you know, reportedly after. And if you didn't know, they're reporting it now, like that they were after, and told them no because of NIL money. And the football team is not in the stratosphere in terms of NIL that the basketball team is. And it's not in the success that the basketball team has had either. And you need way more players in football to be able to like make this big difference. And so I just don't know that that's ever going to be the case. I don't think that the transfer portal is ever going to be great for the Aztecs unless they don't lose their own players. So if there's ever a large defection of their own players, the players that, at least resume-wise, and I want to be real clear about this, at least resume-wise, that their resumes of who they lose are always going to be bigger and better than the resumes of the guys that they're going to bring in. And that's just going to kind of be across the board. But, you know, I really like the approach that Sean Lewis and they're discovering of saying, look, instead of funneling all of these high school tapes and all these recruits through our small recruiting staff, we're going to use the broader staff to be able to help us to canvas them. I think that's brilliant. And I think it's those kinds of, we got to just kind of do things a little bit different, you know, that mentality of them to be able to say, look, we got to find a way as the staff to be able to figure out how to not just replicate what's happening elsewhere, but to understand who we are, and then to say, okay, so this is what we have available to us. How can we do the job that needs to be done at the highest level? And so then I think that's, you know, the proof will be in the pudding. I mean, if they're able to, you know, dedicate all this time to recruiting, I mean, that is nuts. 600 to 700 guys in the 2025 class in 2 months. That's bonkers. And so one of two things is happening, at least it would seem, maybe three, I don't know. Like, these guys did a great job and it's as nuts as it sounds, or they analyze 600 to 700 guys in a very like poor way. Right? I mean, it's just too haphazard and you can't do that many in an efficient manner. But if they pulled it off again, and they caught up to the transfer of the staff, then I don't think there's anything going forward where you could say that Sean Dillon being hired and the process that they did it wasn't good. And you know, I think that's another piece of all of this is, just because you had to do something at the beginning doesn't necessarily mean you have to do the exact same way forever. And so I'm curious to see of it, but there definitely does seem to be, I don't know. Do you think that I'll ask you this question. Do you think that there's been a greater emphasis on recruiting, or do you think that they just happen to be better at talking about it?
It's hard to say.
Mm-hmm.
They're definitely better about talking about it.
Yeah.
I think the skill position, like wide receivers that they got, was very impressive. And I think a lot of that has to do with the offense.
Mm-hmm.
They've been getting safeties and corners really well for years. So getting an influx of that. But the getting wide receivers is a big shift with the new coaching staff. But like, if you talk about offensive line, they need to go get more Cade Bennett's, right? Guys who are in a Power 5 not playing, who can come into a non-Power 5 and dominate, or at least get all conference, 2 years in a row. But 3 years later now, I don't know if a Cade Bennett would still come to San Diego State, considering all the recruiting and all the emphasis on offensive linemen. Because we saw a lot of backup offensive linemen from Power 5 schools enter the portal and stay and go to different Power 5 schools instead of coming to the group of 5 schools, which they were doing 2-3 years ago. So that has a lot to do with NIL, for sure. And then you saw Drew as a redshirt freshman, play, 6 games and go to Washington, a national runner-up in the championship game.
Yep.
Cade Bennett obviously played, BCD. Those guys played and started for 2 and 3 years. So you could see why Power 5 schools wanted them. But then you look at Drew, and he showed enough in those 6 games to say we want him. And yeah, it's cutthroat, and it's tough for a school like San Diego State with literally no NIL money to compete with that stuff. And that's why they go JUCO ranks. But as we've seen, at least Jonah Tavai is a great example of it working out and turning into an All-American. But we've seen the last couple of years that some of the other guys haven't.
Yeah, and I mean, to say that San Diego State has no NIL, so I'm not exactly sure which trip it was, but on one of these trips, either was covering something, and as I came back, the person that I randomly sat next to was Bennett Walker, who is a transfer from Eastern Michigan, and I'm like, well, okay, well, I guess I'm supposed to talk to this guy about what I do and stuff like that. And we started going through it, but that's the stipend that San Diego State gives its athletes. Was a really cool thing for him, and was something that he mentioned as something that matters to him. And so I think that there's a lot going for the university that's beyond NIL, that kind of moves it maybe a little bit above where some of these other schools are, because it does give the full allotment for those scholarships. But I think it's huge but again, I think it's huge that obviously that work continues for the university. But I also think it's interesting that, they have to pivot and figure out what to do regardless of that, right? And I really thought it was interesting and good of what you talked about, where you were saying that 3 years ago, the Cade Bennett's of the world were coming to San Diego State, and that you don't see that as much. And so that I think is going to be really interesting, because NIL is new. Every year there's all kinds of flux. Once one team starts to win and people start saying, well, what did they do? And then that starts getting copied and all that kind of stuff. There's going to be a new normal at some point. And I actually, the place that I actually think could be really good for San Diego State, kind of coming full circle, is the JUCO ranks. I think that there are less Power 5 schools who are saying to themselves, let me go out and get a guy who's at a JUCO, who started as a true freshman, as a redshirt freshman, redshirt sophomore. I think they would much rather go and grab Drew as a party and say, we're going to pay that guy the NIL money, and he's actually played at an FCS level, versus seeing how that translates, right? The jump up between San Diego State and Washington is not as big as the jump up between any JUCO and San Diego State. And so I think that, it could possibly be that San Diego State, the place where they might have access to a higher group of athletes, could actually in fact be at that JUCO ranks, that 10 years ago, there were guys that they really couldn't get conversations with, or maybe they get conversations, but they really couldn't get them in the door because they were going to go Power 5. But now those guys, they're not as attractive to those Power 5 guys because there's a greater risk. And then I think there's the other side of it is I think what you saw with AJ Duffy, which is guys that need to show that they can produce on the highest level. And this is AJ Duffy's 3rd year in college. And so he finishes this year. If he went really fast, if he's an early enrollee, if he goes really fast during summer school, he could graduate at the end of this year. And then as a graduate, go and say, I can go wherever I want at any time, doesn't even have to wait for windows. But even if he doesn't, I mean, they're taking away all the second-time transfer rules and that stuff anyhow. And so I think that's another interesting aspect of it, is there could be these guys who found themselves buried at whatever school that they were at. And again, you're not going to necessarily get playing time if you go to another school that's the equivalent of Florida State. So you go into a place where you think you can get early time. Same thing, I think, with high-level recruits. If you're, that high three-star recruit, low 4-star recruit, and you miss the NIL bubble for whatever reason, that money doesn't come into you in a significant enough way, you might say, I'm going to go to San Diego State. I'm going to show that I can play, and then I'm going to go ask them to open up the piggy bank after that. So I think there's a lot of different approaches to it. The part of it that I find just as interesting is I'm not sure that Sean Lewis and his staff will necessarily do what's 100% in the best interest of San Diego State and the place that San Diego State is in. I think that they're going to bet on themselves, which means they're maybe not going to do the most logical things and maybe overreach a little bit and try to basically like change that dynamic to say, yeah, we have great people doing NIL and it's going to hit soon. And our Aztec Fast is going to be able to go and hit it. And all of a sudden you're going to see it really ramp up, and they're going to bet on that, and they're going to recruit like that. I think that you're going to see them bet on themselves as the difference makers. And if they're right, that's going to be another thing for that resume builder, as they're thinking about going to a bigger conference themselves in their own job. But it's hard to, we get too far ahead of all of this. But I was really grateful for the opportunity to look at recruiting, and I like it, man. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I think that I believe that it was kind of inevitable that they were going to fall behind, and to do, uncommon work to be able to at least catch up. I thought was a brilliant move. And, when I asked Sean Lewis, what the coaches were going to do over the break, his first response is like, man, these guys have been going hard. Some of these guys came to San Diego and they need to settle in. They need to, get a little breathing room from it to be recharged. But then he added, and they'll have some recruiting responsibilities.
Yeah, of course, it's spring break for the students, not necessarily for the coaches and the staff. San Diego State football obviously is in the middle of spring practice, but the San Diego State basketball season just ended in the Sweet 16 to UConn. Second year in a row, their season has been ended by UConn, although at a different stage in the tournament. And UConn obviously is poised to win another national championship. To make it all 4 years, San Diego State made the Sweet 16 at least, that UConn won the championship. It's absurd if that happens again.
Yeah.
But as we sit here, like, you have to think that it was a successful season, right? They didn't win a Mountain West regular season title. They didn't win a Mountain West Conference tournament title. But getting to the Sweet 16, I think, is something that means more to some of the players and to the staff. And obviously, they've only done it 4 times, where they've won the tournament, the conference tournament, and the regular season tournament more than 4 times. So, is that a fair assessment that it's a successful season because of the Sweet 16?
Absolutely. And I think the 5 seed helps with that. They obviously didn't, they were the favorites to win both of their games, and they did.
Yeah.
And I think that's another just point to speak to the strength of who they were. I think, and UConn's Coach Hurley, he talked a little bit about this, but I just thought it was a disservice to put all of the guys who were in the Final Four and to bunch them up together. I think San Diego State, no one's played in this tournament in the last 2 years. No one's played with UConn. And so the fact that San Diego State had to match up with them in the Sweet 16, it's almost like they were just basically trying to say, we're not going to have a redo of what we had last year. Like, whatever we want to do, FAU, if they're going to see them, they're going to see them second. And I thought that was pretty weak, to be honest with you. I thought that they should separate those teams as much as possible to try to be able to see, like, are these actually the 2 best teams? Are these actually the 4 best teams? And then see, what can build after that.
I think they lost. I think they lost that. I don't want to say right, but I think they lost that consideration when they dropped to a 5 seed. Like if they were a 4 seed, they would not have been in UConn's East region.
I think they would have. I think they would have because they had to play them in Spokane.
But that the Spokane doesn't necessarily fit into the East region.
Yeah, they still could have done it. Is my point. There were other 5 seeds. There were other ways to have switched it up.
And I saw somebody talk about BYU was the higher 5 seed or the lower 5 seed that should have technically been in UConn's bracket, but they couldn't play on Sundays because of their religious affiliation. And San Diego State got put. I don't know if that's true or not. I did see a few people post about that. Some people smarter than us on how the tournament does things would know. But if that could be potential, but yeah, I mean, I think you're gonna play who you're gonna play eventually. You're gonna have to play UConn eventually, whether it's in the Sweet 16 or farther down the road.
Yeah,
you know,
I just meant that like it's I just don't like that approach to it. You know what I mean? Trying to set up and the idea that FAU was there as another potential, wasn't an accident. They were trying to, make for some compelling stories as you go through. And I just didn't think that it was a good one. It was obviously weird San Diego State playing and then having to go to Boston on a Thursday, giving them the short day. I don't think it affected the outcome one bit. I think UConn wins that game and it is a better team. But I did think that gave a little bit of a glimpse into, what all of these former Pac-12 schools are going to have to deal with on a weekly basis, and having to turn around and get to the East Coast to deal with all that kind of stuff. But to answer your question, I absolutely think that it was a success. I think that, and I wrote an article about this, I don't know honestly how they won as many games as they did. I mean, when we were doing our preview articles, we were just talking about how they're not ever going to be able to rebound. They're going to get bullied inside. They do not have the ability to go small and still be competitive. And we were both right and wrong in the sense that every game that they lost, they got bullied inside, and that was their weakness, and they couldn't overcome it. Happened twice to New Mexico. That's the reason that they're not going to hang a banner, is because of that lack of rebounding. The flip side of it is they were a 5 seed and still somehow managed in certain games to be able to not have that be an issue, to minimize that, to have people, who are smaller fighting with bigger guys and the ball bouncing the right way and whatever else that needs to be a part of it. And I just think that that's remarkable. It's remarkable that, I think you had asked Coach Dutcher, why Miles Heide and Jaden Ledee didn't play next to each other very much. And I think the answer is what they brought physically inside was so similar that it probably wouldn't have helped a whole bunch in doing what they were erasing, what they were trying to erase. But that they were so successful through just kind of that dogged Aztec determination, where it's just like, yeah, we're going to be undersized here. And you know what? We're still going to rebound. We're still going to be elite at this. And it's one of those things. They were an elite rebounding team for their size. And that being elite for their size allowed them to be a 5 seed, allowed them to get to the Sweet 16. And I don't think that a lot of players in basketball and sports in general, the way that it is, would answer the bell to be able to kind of play that kind of like style. And I don't think that I don't think you're going to see it very often at San Diego State. Brian Dutcher does love to play small, but I don't. But I think that it was especially small, and he was trying to maybe speed up the game, get some scoring, and all those kind of things. But I thought it was just remarkable. I really did. I in some ways, I think this team was more impressive than the team that went to the Final Four. Just because last year's team, like there was a script and they owned the script. They were old, they were veteran, they, they beat up a 19, 20-year-old kid at Alabama. Like, that's not surprising that they were able to go and do that. Obviously FAU and the shot and all those things, but like they were so old and had played together so long that it looked like they had an advantage. Whereas this team, obviously, you have one of the top players in the country. I think if there was a vote over the All-American again, I don't think Jalen Ledee would be on the third team for the AP. But he was sensational. He was the best player. He was the player that even I would argue against UConn, he was the player who was the most focal into what went on. And I think it was just a great overall season. And I think it'll just be interesting because they're facing the same constraints that the football team and every other team at San Diego State is facing. What do they need to have NIL wise to attract people and allow all the other stuff that they're great at to be what attracts somebody? And Mark Ziegler wrote an excellent article this week talking about how Mesa Foundation is increasing the amount and all of those kinds of things. But when we talked with Jeff here on the podcast, they were like, "Oh, we're competitive at $2,000 a month, like we're good." And now it's like, nope, that's not even close. And so that ever-changing world and needing more, it's just the way that it is until one group decides to break off from the rest, and that becomes less of an issue. Congress steps in and says they're going to be exempt from all of these lawsuits and all the different things that people, antitrust stuff, but people can bringing things against them. So then the NCAA would have power to limit A, B, and C. But until those things it's the new reality, and they got to figure out how to do it. And it's interesting.
Yeah, if you talk about rebounding, they actually had a 4.1 overall rebounding margin for the whole season.
Mm-hmm.
So despite all of those comments about rebounding, they still out-rebounded teams by 4 every game. UNLV in the first round of the tournament, they out-rebounded them by 19, I think. So they had good rebounding performances. It was a few games where they got bullied on the boards by bigger teams, and then there was those little moments at the end of games where they gave up offensive rebounds, especially on the road, that kind of cost them. I agree it was a successful season. I think this team probably reached its limit, but I do think their ceiling could have been a little bit higher with a little bit more offensive efficiency. They had some shooters go cold. Micah Parrish and Reese Waters, namely, in the second half of the season. A little bit more from them in terms of shooting could have bumped the team up. Now, if you're playing UConn and whatever round, you're probably going to lose. But you could look at it from a perspective that, like, if you had some better performances during the season and you won some of those games you lost, maybe you're a 3 seed or a 4 seed and you don't play UConn and you get to play another team that like in Alabama last year where you were able to compete with. But inevitably you're gonna meet UConn. But I think the NIL. I like the fact that they moved away from paying everybody the same. I did not think from day one that was a decision that would work as well. And I think with Brian Dutcher allowing Mesa, I guess, to pay the seniors or the upperclassmen more than the young guys, is a good model. But I was actually surprised to see that they paid them. The seniors got $5,000 a month. That's $60,000. That's a lot different than $24,000 a year, which was last year. I think that's a big uplift. And Lamont Butler, he has all these other stuff that he does with, nectar juice and El Pollo Grill and the buzzer beater plaques that he signed. But players, not every player wants to go out and have to work for that stuff, right? They want the money to just come in for just being on the team or a player. And Mesa seems to be doing a better job with recruiting guys, recruiting fans to pay some subscriptions and get their money up. But we'll see. I mean, the blenders thing, that's, I think, worked out really well. Things like that, I think, can play a bigger role. But ultimately, is it going to keep a Keyshawn Johnson from getting a $400,000 NIL deal at Arizona? No. So the increments are good, but is it enough to keep that? We'll see.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it goes back to the same thing. Like, it goes back to the same, just the exact same, I guess, kind of argument is just going and this isn't an accident, right? This isn't an accident. The funny part to me about all the power conferences is they pound their chest like they hit a home run when they started on third base. You know what I mean? And they do everything they can off the field to make sure they don't have to compete on it or on the court. But this reality of NIL has been in place for a few years, and enough of these guys came back, and obviously I don't think we're talking about a rebounding issue if Keyshawn Johnson had come back, right? It's that kind of player who was missing. But I think it puts everything a little bit into perspective, and I think it makes what they're trying to do harder and harder. And there's going to be certain positions that are going to be at a premium. Center is going to be it, and that can break two ways. The young guys that they have, if any of those guys, they might be tall and being a center is not, sometimes they don't equate. But provided that you get enough of them guys in at the same time, they should be able to be good. But the flip side of it becomes, if you do, every other school in America is going to go and they're going to say, here's 250,000 now. Yeah, they'll give you 100K next year, but you can get 250 plus whatever our NIL kind of stuff is. And so it's the game. It's the game that's being played, and San Diego State has got to be involved in it and be in it. The easy part about basketball, as we've talked about over and over again, is you only have so many pockets in which you need to fill when it comes to basketball. And, $1 million for a basketball team can go quite a long way in terms of giving money to those guys. And that same $1 million, if you divide it over the 100 players that's for the football team, it's a much smaller amount. And, there are NIL collectives and things like that, that are giving substantial amounts of money to free agents, basically. And free agency is alive in college football, in men's basketball, women's basketball. We've seen it in softball, baseball, and, the beauty of sports is that people can compete against all odds. And I would argue that the message and the lesson of the 2023-2024 Aztecs is just go and compete. And yep, you have it. Everything we're talking about, they had stacked against them going into last year too. And they were able, with a guy like Darion Trammell, who for one game was better than Alabama's guards in a Sweet 16 game. And in that one game, he was better than Creighton's guards, and they got to a Final Four. And I think that's the way that San Diego State has to continue to be able to perform, is when they get that opportunity, they got to be able to deliver. They got to continue to develop guys, and play their game, be who they are, have their identity, get kids who, I mean, we talked about this with Herb Ledee, he's got a basketball court at his house. Jaden doesn't need NIL the way that he shot and his family and, those kinds of things. That's what he said. That's what, some people need it. And, all of that kind of stuff is the way that it should be talked about and mentioned and gone through. But it's very, very surprising that this team was able to be as good as they were, given the fact that, there were times where they were as bad as it should be on paper. And somehow they were able to erase. And to your point, they had some games where they were so good at rebounding. And you're just like, what? Like, if they could rebound like this, oh my goodness, But then, just inevitably that it's hard to do. It's hard to do. And they did it. They did it for most of it and got to a Sweet 16, just like Kawhi Leonard did, just like Xavier Thames did. It's pretty special.
Yeah, the two quick things before we close this out. I think if you took this year's team and put in Miles Heide as a sophomore, I think that could have fit a lot better because I really liked the Heide-Ledee combo, but you could tell in the big moments in the big games that Heide just wasn't ready yet in terms of being tougher with the ball, being tougher in the paint, holding on to the ball, finishing layups, defending the paint. I think he'll be so much better at all of that next year that if you could have had a second year Miles Heide on this year's team, I think Dutcher would have trusted him more to play that and could have gotten more out of it. And then that leads me to the second point. And we'll talk about recruiting for next year and how next year's team looks. But they're always going to reload. They're going to bring in guys from the portal that are going to help them. But next year's team is going to be young regardless. Because you're losing those 8 of the 9 guys from last year's championship team, national runner-up team, right? Because you lost 5 guys last year and you're losing 3 more this year, right? And Micah Parrish doesn't come back, then you're losing all 9 guys. That's a lot of experience that you're losing. And when even if you bring in experienced guys from the portal, they're not experienced in the San Diego State way. So then you have guys like Reese Waters, Miles Bird, Elijah Saunders, who were role players who are now going to have to be the leaders of the team for the first time while their role expands. So it's going to be interesting to see how Brian Dutcher and the staff mixes that up. But, I wonder if it'll be a step back before a step forward next year. Obviously, it's really too early to say that until we know how the team fills out. But they're going to be very young at a lot of positions next year. And we'll see how those guys, pan out.
Yeah, I think you said it very, very well. I think, and that's the other part of this thing is that anything can happen. I mean, if you're telling me that there's not some NIL collective out there salivating over a guy like Miles Bird, I would be shocked.
Yeah.
And that's that, you know what I mean? Like if we're sitting here and the 3 veterans that you just named who are coming back, that could be their starting backcourt, excuse me. That could be their starting backcourt. Like you could give Miles Bird the ball and say, you're gonna bring it up and as long as, and you could have Reese Waters at the 2, you could have Elijah Saunders at the 3. San Diego State could be huge. On the flip side of it is that those guys could all be, the 2, 3, and the 4 as well, and have the same kind of dynamic, that they had this year. And so it'll be interesting to see. BJ Davis. I mean, he's a guy who, to your point, Miles Heide should have redshirted, right? He answered the bell. I think remember talking with Chris Acker and the conversation that he had was essentially some people see him as more of a center, in which case he needs to get bigger because he was, as you said, not only not strong with the ball, but he got bumped off of what he was doing, even from guards. right? And that comes from age. But Chris Acker said that Dutcher actually sees more in him than being that space eating guy. He sees a forward in him. He sees somebody who can handle the ball, who can be out on the perimeter, who can stretch the floor, who can do those things. And so if he's doing that, he's your 4. And then who's your 5? And I agree with you. I think anything's going to be a step back. I mean, that's the crazy part. They've been to 2 consecutive Sweet 16s, right? And I mean, I still find that amazing. And then Gonzaga's been to 9 in a row. It's just crazy, the consistency and the ability to do that. And so I think that there's a good chance that it'll be a step backwards. But I would say that there's an it factor that Brian Dutcher led teams have, where they're a little bit better than what they look like they're supposed to be on paper, and I think that they will be competing for a Mountain West title, just like they do every single year. I think they'll be fun, but who knows who comes back, who doesn't. If Lamont Butler decides, I'm gonna ride this out, I'm gonna get one more year. I mean, there's so much that could possibly happen after people start, settling down from the season. But I thought it was a great year, great season. I thought that the storylines that were there, I thought were terrific. And, it would have been fun to have seen them not have to run into UConn this early and to see really where they stacked up, with some of these other teams. But you get what you get.
Yeah, one last thing is, Mountain West, right? The highest seed a Mountain West team beat was a 9 seed, TCU, that Utah State beat. And when the 2 teams played 1 seed, they lost by a combined 69 points in those 2 games. So it didn't turn out to be a great showing for the Mountain West. Obviously, San Diego State won 2 games. They got to the Sweet 16 and held the conference up. But, we'll see what impact that has, if any, on next year and how the conference does. Because for all the goodwill that the conference built up from the national media, it kind of all fell flat by the time we're sitting here. So we'll see. Any last words before we close it out?
Yeah, I don't think that a 3-5 showing in the NCAA tournament is reason to think the sky is falling for the conference.
They were 4-6.
Oh, sorry. Even better.
Yeah, but some of those losses were pretty bad.
Oh, no, yeah. I mean, that's the funny part, is that if you go and Nevada wins their 1 game, you're all of a sudden going, oh, it was fine. And it's like, it was no different. I don't think anybody is going and saying that, the Big Ten is overrated because Illinois lost by 25 points to UConn. I think what makes the tournament beautiful, and I think the best thing about it, is that it is not a 7-game series. The best team doesn't win all the time. There's that famous game where Allen Iverson, he makes that shot over Tyronn Lue and he steps over him on there. They won game 1. If it was the NCAA tournament, they would be the NCAA tournament champions. And then they got swept the next 4 games and they weren't even close, and it was just ugly, and clearly the Lakers were the better team, which is the same thing that would have happened as, whatever these things that you want to talk about going on and playing. So, I think the Mountain West, they would have liked to seen them done better. You don't get to decide who you're going to play. The flip side of it is that if they had gotten higher seeds, whatever. But 4-6, that's the final record. It's not terrible. It's not like they were, the SEC that lost an insane amount as the higher seed. That was an implosion. But no one's talking about the SEC is not going to get ranked anymore.
Yep. All right, guys. That's going to do it for us. Hopefully you enjoyed the interview with Sean Dillon and our takeaways and our discussion about the basketball team. A lot more coming up, as we've talked about, some more interviews with the coaching staff coming shortly with some articles to go with it. As always, thank you for listening, liking, sharing, subscribing, following, and we'll talk to you guys next time. You are listening to the SDSU podcast presented by the East Village Times with your hosts Andre Hagberdian and Paul Garrison.